Hello, my name is Rachael Haverporth, and I wrote a book called Into His Glorious Light. It has not come out yet, but a lot of people have already asked me why I would be willing to write a book that was so vulnerable and shared so much of my heart's desires and some of my biggest pains and some of my lowest moments. And I really wrote this book because it was a love story between me and God. It started off as I just needed to heal and I needed ways to express to God my feelings and I needed to hear him back. And I was very blessed during this time that I could hear his voice. So I wrote down the poems and the blogs that he told me, and I started to give them to other people to help them heal. And people told me that I needed to make this into a book because it was a beautiful love story. That's what God told me. It doesn't seem like a love story. There's a lot of trauma, there's a lot of pain, there's a lot of mess in this story. But I felt like I had to write this story to express to people um, the goodness of God and that there is there is glorious light at the end of the tunnel. And this all started, and that was like this book has been 3 years in the making. But a few months ago, God really started to download in my heart um, the purpose of why He did this book. And at the time, I was struggling because it's been 3 years, and I had prayed before the book had actually been told it was going to be published that I didn't have to do this part of the journey alone, and that He would answer the promise so that I didn't feel crazy or I wouldn't be called a false prophet. Um, and I begged and I fasted and I prayed. And here I am today, and I'm going through it with God, and He still hasn't brought the promise. But I was at this point, like, I still love you and I'm going to do it. But I was a little brokenhearted in this moment. And I was starting to lose the hope. And I started to wonder if I could start compromising things. Like, well, maybe I can go on a different promise and maybe that will be better. Maybe I thought this way and this promise will really happen and it'll just look better. Or I thought, maybe I could just throw away the promise altogether, just tell people I was wrong, but it's a beautiful story. Or, maybe it's a compromise. Maybe I get the story and I get the publication, but I don't actually get the promise. And I was struggling with this. But in my human nature, I struggle with control and manipulation. I started to go down a road that was not the road that I think God wanted me to go on. And I live in Alamogordo, New Mexico. In Alamogordo, New Mexico, we don't get a lot of storms. But when we do get storms, they tend to come in clusters and they tend to be somewhat big. And at the time, I have this dog named Tebow. And God loves to use Tebow in my life as an example of his character. And he's used him many times. If you read the book, if you read any of my blogs, you'll see Tebow. He's in there a lot. And Tebow had a little bit of a rough start to his life. He had some trauma. I don't know the trauma. I know when I got him from the vets and I took him home, they told me that they found him on the streets. And I know that he's really scared of loud noises. And I know that he shows signs of some trauma. And in the early years, it was hard to deal with his trauma because he was self-destructing my love for him. And he did things that made it hard to love him sometimes. So I can relate to that. So Tebow I've had for 11 years, and we have gone through the trauma, and he's been very safe and very loved. But Tebow does not like storms. And in these last 3 or 4 days that we had these storms, he had woke me up in the middle of the night because he likes to cling to my head when there's a storm. He had been and even though he woke me up, I still cuddle him. I love him. I speak to him with hope and just beautiful words. And then the next day he comes running at me and he's in my lap and I'm petting him because there was a storm. He was scared. He's shaking. He's panting. He's losing his mind. And I just keep petting him and I'm loving him. But by the third day, he comes running at me like a missile. And I'm like, Tebow, I love you. But it's been 11 years. And in 11 years, you've been through some storms with me. And yes, the rain has been out there, but it's never flooded this house. Yes, the thunder is loud, but it's never gotten to you. And the lightning, it does make a lot of light and does make a lot of imaging on the walls, but it's never struck you. So I don't understand why you're still so scared. And I said this out loud because I live alone, so why not? And I heard God say, yes. Yes. What do you mean, God? And God goes, Rachel, I know you've been through some stuff. I know you've had some trauma, but at least in the last 3 years, you have been so in tune with me. You have been in my lap. I've been speaking to you. I've whispered to you, and yet you're still reacting the same way to the storms. And I go, huh, That's true. I have been reacting the same, even though I've been through this stuff with you for 3 years. And he's like, the storm has never hurt you. Yes, you've had some feelings and emotions, but you have ultimately been in my hands. And he's like, just like Tebow. Now, if I was to stop the storm every single time Tebow got scared, and he was like, stop this storm. And I'm telling you, if you've ever seen this dog be scared of a storm, he'd want it stopped right away. Well, then there would be no fruit. There would be no grass that he plays in, and he's a spoiled dog, and he gets homemade meals, and I put fruit in his food, and he loves that fruit, and he loves the vegetables that I put in that. So if there was no storms, there'd be no fruit, there'd be no grass, and really the things that Tebow loves wouldn't be there. And so I started to recognize that we have to have storms in our life in order to see the fruit and to have the things that God has for us. And then God started to speak to me because he showed me that it wasn't the storm that was freaking Tebow out. It was the way that Tebow chose to respond to the storm. After 11 years of being safe in my arms and always having me to comfort him, Tebow still chose to react with being so scared that he pants and he shakes. And in fact, there's times I have to throw him in the car and we have to drive around because he'll spend hours, even after the storm has gone, so scared of what just happened that I actually have to drive him around to calm him down. And so God showed me that I've tried everything. I've tried to give him pills. I've tried to give him thunder jackets. I've tried everything to calm him down. But ultimately, it's Tebow's choice to choose to calm down, to choose to realize that he's safe. All the facades that I've tried to give Tebow, and that's how I look at it. Like God showed it to me. I've had these facades in my life where I've tried to get the comfort of God that only God can that only God can give. And I've tried everything. I've tried vacations. I've tried doing things my own way, control, manipulation. I've tried drugs. I've tried all these things. I've tried to go from relationship to relationship, but none of that brought me the peace. And then when I went through a storm, I always reacted the same way, and I was always miserable. So God showed me, like, I spent so much money on Tebow trying to calm him down, but God showed me there's no facade, and that the only thing that makes us calm in a storm is the love of the person that's keeping us safe. And for me, it is God, and for Tebow, it is me. So I also thought about you in the beginning of my journey, like how Tebow, like there's nothing he can do to stop that storm. He can't plead with the storm to go away. He can't bark at the storm to go away. He can't do anything to make that storm go away. I remember in the beginning of my own story, I pleaded with God. I prayed with God. I tried to give him the promise. I tried to make my own promise. I tried to be perfect. I tried to think if I could do everything that God wants me to do, he'll make the storm go away. And none of that worked. None of that, all it did was stress me out. All it did was make me miserable because I wasn't embracing the love of Christ. I was trying to force his hand to stop the storm. Um, and I started to realize in this process that God did not create us. He did. Our inheritance is not that we won't go through some storms in life. His promise is that we are the ones that can learn to weather the storm well. And we do that with peace. We do that because we know where we are. The storm draws Tebow to me. When the storm comes, he has to run into my arms, and he has to run into my presence. The storm drew me closer to God. The storm made me sit down and look at my Father, to behold him, to spend time with him. And in this place, God showed me who he truly was. And I could hear his voice. I could see his eyes. I could feel his comfort all around me. And I realized that God sends storms. He's the one that sends storms. And when he sends those storms, we have choices that we can make. And we can learn to anchor into him. And this reminds me of a place that, like, I live in Alamogordo, New Mexico, and we have a place called White Sands. And at White Sands, there's nothing but sand. And so when you're trying to look for a focal point, when you're trying to remember where you are, if you want to stray away or you want to walk somewhere, you have to have something that you can focus on so you can come back to that place. And if you don't do that, You will get lost. And in fact, almost every year that I've lived here, there's been a person that has died because they've gotten lost, because they didn't have an anchor point. They didn't have a place that they could say, this is where I need to go. And everything looks the same. And in our world, it's easy to say, well, everyone else is doing that. Well, this seems like it's a good thing. But if you know your anchor, if you know where to look, you can always go back to that and you won't get lost. You won't get swept away into like the same thing in oceans. If you can get swept away if you lose where your focus point is. And so in this storm, I had to be so focused on God that I started to recognize that this wasn't of Him or this was of Him. And I started to really know who He was. I really started to learn His presence and His character. And I started to get away from my facades and the things that I believed that He was. And when I did that, I actually started to become anchored. And I started to actually stand on the solid ground of who Christ was. I couldn't get lost or swept away. I couldn't like lose my place where I was because I was like, there's God. He's right there in front of me. And I started to become more like Him. I became what I was beholding. So whenever other storms came in, I could anchor in. I could anchor in and I can say, I'm not going to be moved by the storm. I am in a firm foundation. I'm not going to be swept away. No matter how many storms come, I know what to do because I know I've been through this before. The first storm knocked me out and I had to relearn. I had to rebuild. The second storm, it made me waver. I had to relearn. I had to rebuild. But then by the third or fourth storm, I knew what I was doing and I could anchor in. And you can't be an anchor if you don't have a storm. And so God showed me in this process that I had become complacent in my life. I was living like the world and I didn't even realize it. I thought I was living for Him, but instead I was living like a slave. And God did not create me to be a slave. And He sent a storm. Yes, it wasn't Satan who sent the storm. I don't believe that. I believe God sent this storm in my life so that I could realize that I had become just like the world. I could realize that I was living like a slave. I had no idea that I had strayed so far from Him, that I had gotten lost and didn't have my anchor to look to. I was not rooted into a steady ground. I was rooted into an unsteady ground. And I had to choose. Was I going to live like I was living and not be rooted and crumble and be swept away like the rest of the world, or be like those hikers in White Sands where they got so lost that they couldn't come back? Or was I going to become anchored and rooted? And in this story, the first story that you will read when you read my book is about a princess. And this princess was meant to live in the garden. She was meant to live in the palace with her king. And that's what I was meant to be. But because of my hurt and my pain and my trauma, I started to forget who I was. And because I forgot who I was, I started to leave that palace. I started to leave the presence of my king. And the next thing I knew, I forgot that I was royalty. I forgot that I had an inheritance because I was a princess, because of who my father was, not because of who I was or what was done to me, but who my father was, that I actually started to live a life of slavery. And I was stuck there. I was stuck in my life of slavery because I didn't realize that I deserved more, that I had an inheritance more than that. And I started to live a life that didn't reflect Christ. I started to live a life where I was miserable and I was just being beat up by the enemy. So God sent a storm. He sent a storm because He said, you can't stay here. And I started to realize that I was not happy where I was. I was in this pit that I had built myself, full of facades and these things that I thought that I could put my life upon. I thought if I could control things, if I could manipulate things, if I could just not love, if I could just stay where I was, that I would be happy there. But in this storm, I started to realize I couldn't believe the promise that God had for me. I couldn't see myself the way that He did unless I let my facades come tumbling down. And I realized one day, in the worst of it, and when I was just stuck in the biggest mess of it all, that I was standing in a pit and legitly, I had a gun up to my head. And I said, God, if you are not bigger than my pain right now, than my facades, than living like a slave, then I don't even know what to do. I don't even want to live anymore. And in this moment, literally in this moment, with a gun to my head, I heard Jesus crying. I heard Him crying, saying, this is not what I have for my daughter. And I could envision that God, the king, right? Like the king came down into my pit, into my slavery. He came down and he said, I want you to stay here. I want to bring you back to the palace where you belong. And I'm sitting here like, why would you want to be in the pit with me? You are the king, you are royalty. And he said, because I don't want to leave you here. And in this one clear moment that I had, if through my pain and through my hurt, I saw the cross and I saw Jesus' body just hanging on that cross. And he looked at me and he said, I died for you, even in this pit, for this moment. Not, I didn't die for you just because you were a princess. I died for you in this moment because you're still worthy to me. And I'm not going to leave you here. And he was laughing. And I was like, why are you laughing? I am the lowest I've ever been. I can't see hope. I can't see a future. I can't even see waking up tomorrow and living tomorrow. I am so tired. That's why I'm here anyway, because I don't want to live like this anymore. And he looked at me and I just knew. It's because he always knew. He always knew that I was going to be the daughter that could weather the storm. He always knew that I would be the daughter that would come back to this palace and live with him and share his dreams and share his hopes. And for the first time in my life, as he's speaking this, right? This is 2 years later. He's speaking this to me just a few months ago as he's speaking to me about the storms. And I start to have the most freedom that I've ever had because I realize, what can Satan do to me? What can Satan do to me when he sent, like, let's say he sends a storm and I go running to my father and I sit in his lap and I'm in his presence and his comfort and his peace and his joy just overlaps me and I can just relax in that and I can just wait for the storm to pass. So what are you going to do, Satan? You're going to send me to my father, and in that time he's going to create all this beauty through that storm. There's going to be fruit and there's going to be grass and there's going to be trees, and I'm going to weather that storm, and I'm not going to weather it in anxiety or fear, but I'm just going to lay in his, just like the disciples should have done. And when he was in the boat, I'm just going to lay with him as he sleeps. I'm going to sleep. And when it passes, there's going to be so much fruit. There's going to be so much goodness. And it was like chains broke off of me, all the anxiety, all the fear, because I realized there was nothing that man can do to me. Because even if you kill me, even if death is the worst thing that can happen to me, my inheritance is that I get to have a crown with Christ in heaven. And so it was like, have I spent 30 years so afraid? Why did I spend so much time shaking and panting and being just terrified like Tebow when I could have just embraced my inheritance as a daughter of a king? And I started to really realize the importance of the story of Mephibosheth, Jonathan's son. And his inheritance has always been that he, through Saul, had an inheritance to be in that palace. But because of Saul's poor decisions and the things that he made, the generational curse, he was taken out of that palace. Um, and in that process, not only was he taken away from his inheritance and taken away from a palace to slavery, but someone that he trusted, the nurse that was to take care of him, dropped him and he experienced trauma. And in that trauma, he was crippled. And when he was crippled, not only did he lose his inheritance in one day, he lost his ability to walk, he lost his ability to be the person that he was. And that was probably so devastating to him. I can't even imagine, except I can only compare it to my own story and how crippled I felt through my trauma and the things that had happened to me in my life. And Mephibosheth may have known who King David was because he's a king. And he may have been under his leadership, and he may have heard stories about King David, but he didn't know the character of King David. He might have known his power, he might have known his royalty, but he didn't know King David's character. He didn't know his personality. He didn't know his laugh. He really didn't know the king. And he didn't know the king's even motive for wanting him to be brought back to the palace. And so in this time, Mephibosheth had to trust. He had to go back to the place that caused him trauma. He had to go back to the place that was his worst fear, but also his inheritance. And to do that, he had to get on a servant's back of a king that he didn't really know. And he didn't know whether that king had good plans for him or bad plans, but he had to make a choice. He had to make a choice that even though he couldn't see the future and he didn't know what was going to happen, that if he got on that servant's back, that he could trust that he would be taken back to a place in the palace. And once he was taken back into the palace, even though he was crippled, even though his father had lost the inheritance that was promised to him, the generational curse, he got to sit at the table redeemed. He got to sit at the table no longer a slave. And he got to know King David's voice. He got to know King David's character. He got to realize that King David had good plans for him, that King David could share his dreams and his desire. And he wasn't living on the outside anymore. He wasn't there to be tormented by other people that were living like slaves because no one could get to him in the palace. He was guarded, he was safe, and he got to know the king. So God showed this to me because I needed to know God intimately. I needed to stop living like a slave. I needed to have a storm in my life so I could go back to living like a queen, like a princess in the palace. And even though I felt crippled, and even though I felt like I didn't deserve my inheritance, and I definitely did not feel worthy anymore, I had to realize that my worth was because of who my king was. My identity is what he tells me that I am. And I can't do that living outside of the palace. I can't truly know him unless I'm sitting at his table. So the storm is my story into his glorious light. It is a love story of a storm that God sent so I would be brave enough to jump on his servant's back, to be taken back to the table, even though it felt like it was a place of my trauma where I was wounded, even though I didn't feel worthy, even though I didn't feel like I had what it took to be a princess. I had to jump back on that servant's back for him to take me back so I could share in his hopes and his desires with him. And I could be the princess that I was always meant to be and not live in the streets. And this is so beautiful because the story doesn't happen. This is why it's a love story, even though it's full of trauma and sadness and these things, because a king, he lowered himself because he wanted to save his princess. He didn't want her to live the life she was living. He knew her worth and he didn't want his daughter not to be where he placed her to be. So 8 years ago, I was called to write my very first poem called Dancing in Her Father's Light. And that poem has become the front of the cover of my book. And it was the solution to this whole problem, this whole storm that he gave me. Before the storm even began, 8 years ago, in faith, I wrote a poem. And I actually wrote it out so it could become a video. And he gave me that because in this poem, I was sitting in the very end, I'm sitting in the lap of my father. It starts off that I'm in jail and I can't get out of that jail. And I'm walked through. My father opens the jail cell and he walks me to this place of beauty, into this forest. And he transforms me so I can sit in his lap. Even though the storm is coming, I choose him. I choose to be in his presence. I choose to stay in all the beauty that's around me and not run because of the storm. So this whole book relates to what this story is telling me, that the King of the universe had a beautiful purpose and a beautiful design, that he could save his daughter who had left her palace, who had left the safety of her king, who had forgotten who he was and just knew him from afar. And I just want to be honest and open with you guys. Yes, God created one Rachael Haverporth who was going to write a book called Glorious into His Glorious Light. But there's only one you. And the thing of it is, God created all of us with purpose. We all are we are all princesses and princesses in his kingdom. And he wants to create a love story just for you, a storm that will bring you closer to him, into his light, because he wants you to sit at the table with him. He wants you to hear his desires and to hear his destiny for you. And he wants you to step up into your destiny. And only you can do it. You were created to be the person he created you to be. And that's my hope, that's my desire, that people read this book and they see him for who he is, and they see themselves for who they are, and they step into what he has always called them to be. to sit at a table with him, to hear his dreams, to hear his desires. So when the world tells them differently, when the circumstances say differently, you can be like, I literally sit with my king. And when he tells me that he's going to do these things, he's going to do these things. And I'm going to become who he said I'm going to become. And that I feel now that I just had this vision that I'm sitting with him at the table and my mouth is just in awe that I get to be with the king. And I respect him and I honor him because he's king, because he deserves it, because that's what his position is. And because of that, I don't want the enemy to tell me any different. I don't want the world to tell me any different. I will be his daughter. I will carry out the things that he's told me to carry out. I will I will be everything that he says I can be. And I believe for you that you will too. If you will just let the storm move you in peace to the places that he has you, so that you will sit back into his palace at his table. I don't care how crippled you feel. I don't care how unworthy you feel. God always sends a servant to bring his children back. He always goes back into the dirtiest places to say, you are my princess. You are my prince. And I will do whatever it takes to bring you back. So I pray right now in the name of Jesus Christ that you will listen to that prayer. I pray that no matter how hard it feels, how down you feel, how you feel like maybe there's no way back, you've done too much. You've done too much sinning. You look too broken, that you remember these stories and that you can read my book and you can see I was pretty broken, that I really, from anyone else's eyes, did not deserve a beautiful love story, but you deserve a beautiful love story and you are God's beautiful love story. So I pray that you hear this message and I pray that you start to walk from the darkness into his glorious light.